Detective Elias Thorne was an architect of silence, not by nature, but by trade. In the echoing, grimy precinct of Northwood's homicide, the only sound louder than the old air conditioning unit was the persistent, low-frequency hum of unsolved trauma. Thorne, a man whose face seemed permanently etched by the city's neon-hazed despair, was a legend, a walking contradiction of meticulous procedural work and an almost psychic intuition that others dismissed as luck. He sat in the sparse interrogation room, the fluorescent light buzzing with nervous energy. Though no one was being questioned, he was just trying to process the files. His partner, the pragmatic and perpetually stressed Detective Carmen Ruiz, stood by the observation mirror, sipping lukewarm coffee. Another one, Elias. Body found at the old Harrington warehouse, Pier 7. Mutilation, same signature as the others. The exact same, down to the incision depth. Ruiz sighed, the steam briefly clouding her glasses. This makes 3 in 2 months. 3 bodies, 0 leads, and a killer we're calling the curator because he takes something. Thorne didn't look up from the file photos. They were stomach-churning. The victim, a dock worker named Thomas Vance, was arranged with a terrible, artistic precision. The missing piece wasn't an organ or a trophy, but something far stranger, far less quantifiable. He takes the voice, Thorne murmured, pushing a photo of the victim's throat across the table. The cut was clean, surgical, but the forensic report confirmed the impossible. The vocal cords were not merely severed, they were absent, vanished without a trace of surrounding tissue damage. Ruiz stepped inside. Her heel clicks sharp on the linoleum. Stop it with the poetry, Elias. They were removed. Highly skilled, maybe medical. We're running background checks on every ex-surgeon with a psych history in the Tri-County area. No, Carmen. Removed is too crude a word for this. There's no trace evidence. No blood spatter where there should be gallons. The body is desiccated, almost preserved. He doesn't just silence them. He extracts the very echo of their sound. Thorne tapped a specific spot on the crime scene photo. A faint, almost invisible, shimmering residue on the concrete floor near the body's head. What did the lab say about this? Ruiz checked her notes, frowning. Says it's inert. A complex protein structure, non-human, non-animal. They think it's some kind of industrial sealant or a weird resin, but they can't match it. Too unique. It's not sealant, Thorne insisted, the fluorescent light catching a haunted gleam in his eye. It's the only thing he leaves behind, the only proof of his presence. It looks like crystallized sound. Ruiz scoffed, but a flicker of genuine unease crossed her face. Thorne's hunches had saved their careers more than once, but this felt like a dive off the deep end. Look, Elias, she said, leaning in. Internal affairs is breathing down our necks. The city council is hysterical. They want a perp, not a philosophy major. We need solid police work. We need the motive. What does a dock worker have in common with the last victim, a socialite, and the one before that, a street preacher? Thorne closed the file, the silence in the room suddenly oppressive. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long, distorted shadow. I know the common denominator, Carmen. It's what no one else is hearing. He walked to the wall and placed his palm flat against the cool, painted cinder block. He closed his eyes, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if listening to the wall itself. Every victim, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, was known for something very specific. The preacher for his sermons, the socialite for her booming, unforgettable laugh, and Vance. He was notorious at the docks for his off-key, drunken sea shanties, loud, incessant, irritating to everyone. Ruiz waited, her breath held. The curator isn't killing them for their occupation or their status, Thorne concluded, pulling his hand away from the wall. He turned, his gaze holding an intensity that made the room feel suddenly smaller. He's killing them for their noise, and he is taking the noise with him. He picked up his coat. The inert residue, Carmen? It's a sonic echo, a trace of what was forcibly pulled from the air, from the flesh. It's the only thing that proves he can do the impossible. We're dealing with a force that doesn't just hate loud people. It's harvesting their capacity for sound. Where are you going? Ruiz asked, her hand instinctively hovering over the butt of her service weapon. To find out where he stores his collection, Thorne replied, heading for the door. Because if he's taking the noise, there must be a place where the collective silence is screaming. Detective Elias Thorne drove the scarred, unmarked Crown Victoria through the perpetually choked arteries of Northwood. The sounds of the city, the blare of horns, the guttural rumble of a passing subway car, the thin, irritating whine of a distant police siren, were now amplified in his mind, turning the mundane cacophony into a potential threat. Every loud sound was a target waiting to be silenced. He ignored Ruiz's frantic text messages urging him to return and follow proper procedure. Protocol was a shield for the weak-willed. Intuition was the tool of the hunter. His destination was the dusty, forgotten basement office of Dr. Alastair Finch, a disgraced former lead acoustical engineer at the city's largest university, now relegated to consulting work on structural soundproofing. Finch's office was a shrine to sonic obsession. Walls lined with acoustic foam, shelves overloaded with archaic recording equipment, and bizarre, hand-drawn schematics for noise reduction devices. The air felt heavy, almost dampened. "You bring me something interesting, Detective Thorne," Finch said, his voice a low, raspy monotone. He was hunched over a microscope, his magnifying goggles making his eyes enormous and unsettling. He was examining the plastic baggie containing the shimmering residue from the warehouse floor. Thorne leaned against a sound-dampening panel, the material sucking the volume out of his own movements. That's what the lab called a complex, non-human, inert protein structure. "What do you call it, Doctor?" Finch adjusted a dial on the scope. "I call it impossible. The atomic structure is too orderly. It exhibits characteristics of a crystalline solid, yet it contains peptides. It defies the laws of physics as we understand them, Detective. It has the structure of a sound wave, rendered into a stable physical state." He looked up, a manic intensity in his eyes. Imagine a sonic boom hitting a pane of glass, and instead of shattering, the glass absorbed the boom and became stronger, denser. This is the echo of a violently silenced sound, chemically preserved. It's what happens when noise is forcibly stopped, not dissipated. If you were harvesting human sound, Dr. Finch, where would you store it? Thorne pressed. Finch gave a small, chilling laugh. "In a perfect vacuum, Detective. Or, perhaps, in a resonating chamber designed to hold a frequency captive. A place where the collective silence would vibrate with the intensity of a billion trapped whispers." Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Ruiz had run the background checks again, not on the victims' jobs, but on their histories of complaints, noise violations, fights, public disturbances. It was a dead end until she cross-referenced the victims' addresses, past and present, against municipal records for noise complaints filed by others. That was when the chilling pattern emerged. All three victims, Thomas Vance, the dock worker, Sylvia Reed, the socialite, and Pastor Jeremiah Wells, the preacher, had at one point lived within a 5-block radius of a single, forgotten landmark. The Hawthorne Auditorium. The Hawthorne, abandoned decades ago, was infamous in city lore. It had been the site of a tragic stampede during a massive, overcapacity rock concert in the late 1980s. Dozens had been injured, and the venue was immediately condemned, the city citing structural instability and, pointedly, uncontrollable and potentially dangerous acoustic resonance. Ruiz slammed the file shut, the sound sharp and aggressive in the quiet office. She pulled up the addresses and overlaid them on the city map. It wasn't just proximity. The victims had all lived there during the same narrow window of time, the year immediately following the Hawthorne disaster, a period when the entire neighborhood had been engaged in bitter, months-long legal battles over the constant, low-frequency drone that lingered from the structural damage. She grabbed her keys and phone, dialing Thorne. He didn't answer. Ruiz sent a single, urgent text, "Hawthorne Auditorium. Check the records for noise." Complaints. They all lived near it. Right after the '88 riot. "I'm heading there now." Thorne was already driving toward the Hawthorne district. Finch's words about a resonating chamber had latched onto his intuition. He didn't see the text until he was a block away. The Hawthorne was a decaying monolith of concrete and broken glass, a silent sentinel in a blighted neighborhood. Thorne found a gap in the rusted chain-link fence and slipped through. The air inside the perimeter was unnaturally still. The city's din completely muted. He moved through the derelict lobby, his flashlight beam cutting through the dust motes dancing in the shafts of moonlight. He reached the main stage. The grand space was a cavern of rot and decay, but the acoustics were unnerving. The tiniest scuff of his boot echoed for an unnaturally long time, before being abruptly swallowed by the vast, oppressive silence. He saw the fresh disturbance. A section of the stage floor, directly over the orchestra pit, had been recently patched with new, dark wood, crudely painted to match the old. Thorne knelt, pushing aside a piece of debris. The patch was a trap door, poorly sealed. He jammed his crowbar into the seam and pried it open. A burst of cold air, stale and chemical-smelling, rushed out. He shone his light down into the black void. It was not the orchestra pit. The drop was much deeper, opening into a newly excavated, smooth-walled bunker beneath the building's foundation. The light landed on a surface. The walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with the same specialized sound-dampening material Finch had in his office. It was a perfect sonic vacuum, and in the very center, on a pristine white pedestal, a single, horrifying object was displayed. A human ribcage, meticulously polished, but with every intercostal space stuffed tight with the shimmering, solidified residue. It looked like a macabre, crystalline sculpture, a horrifying vessel ready to be filled. Then, from the darkness behind him, Thorne heard the softest, most polite of coughs. "You found my gallery, Detective, but I'm afraid the latest exhibit isn't quite finished yet." The voice was soft, almost melodious, a stark contrast to the grim tableau Thorne had just discovered. He spun, flashlight beams slashing through the gloom, momentarily blinding the figure standing at the edge of the pit. That it wasn't a hulking monster or a shadowy phantom. It was a man of unassuming stature, neatly dressed in a tailored, dark suit. His hair was impeccably combed, and his face, though pale and sharp-featured, bore an expression of serene, almost scholarly calm. In his hand, he held a small, polished conductor's baton. "Dr. Alistair Finch." Thorne breathed, the name a bitter taste in his mouth. Finch smiled, a small, polite gesture devoid of warmth. "A pleasure to finally meet you, Detective. Though I confess, I had hoped for a more private unveiling of my life's work." He gestured with the baton towards the ribcage sculpture below. "A magnificent piece, wouldn't you agree? The human form, so perfectly designed to contain and propagate sound. A true testament to our acoustic potential." "You're the curator," Thorne stated, his hand inching towards his weapon. "A rather unimaginative title, I must say." Finch mused, tapping the baton against his palm. "I prefer the conductor, for I am merely orchestrating a grand symphony of silence, a correction, if you will, to the unbearable cacophony that plagues our world. The victims," Thorne pressed, pulling his service weapon. "Vance Reed Wells. Why them?" Finch sighed, a sound of genuine lament. "They were the instruments of discord, Detective. Each of them, in their own way, contributed to the sonic pollution that festered around this very building. After the Hawthorne incident, when the city condemned this beautiful hall for its uncontrollable resonance, they tried to silence it. But the truth, Detective, is that the people were the problem. The incessant complaints, the blaring music, the drunken shouts, the endless litigation. Their noise poisoned the very air around this temple of sound." He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Thorne's. "I dedicated my life to understanding sound, its beauty, its power. And then, after the tragedy here, I heard something else. A whisper, a growing, terrible pressure. The city was trying to silence the very concept of sound itself. And those three were the loudest, the most egregious offenders in the aftermath. Their constant noise was an insult to this place. So you decided to silence them permanently," Thorne said, his voice flat. "Permanently, but elegantly," Finch corrected. "You see, Detective, simply killing them would be crude, a waste. Their noise would simply dissipate into the ether. No, I discovered a way to extract it, to crystallize their sonic signature, to capture the very essence of their personal cacophony, and preserve it." He gestured again with the baton, this time to the walls of the newly built chamber. This, detective, is my resonance chamber. A perfect acoustic void. Here, their collected noise is finally at peace. Contained. Pure. Their individual dissonances are now harmonized into a single, profound silence. And the ribcage? Thorne asked, a cold dread washing over him. Finch's smile widened. A vessel. A conductor's instrument. Each space filled with the crystallized echo of a truly grating sound. A testament to human noise, rendered beautiful in its final, silent form. And now, I have almost completed my masterpiece. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the lobby, followed by the clatter of loose masonry. Elias, Thorne, are you in here? It was Ruiz's voice, amplified by the hollow acoustics of the abandoned theater. Finch's serene expression twisted into a snarl of pure fury. More noise. Always more noise. He raised the baton, not at Thorne, but at the stage lights above them. Thorne saw the small, glinting device attached to the tip of the baton, a sophisticated, miniaturized sonic emitter. Before he could react, Finch swung the baton down at a high-pitched, piercing shriek ripped through the air, vibrating through Thorne's very bones. It wasn't just loud. It felt like a physical blow, a focused wave of pure sound energy. The few remaining stage lights above them exploded, showering sparks and glass. Thorne staggered, his ears ringing, momentarily disoriented. Finch didn't hesitate. He swung the baton again, this time aiming directly at Thorne. The detective threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding a second, blinding burst of focused sonic energy that ripped through the air where he had been standing, leaving the stench of ozone. You are a part of the noise, detective, and you will be silenced. Finch shrieked, his cultured voice now curdled with a chilling, fanatic rage. Thorne recovered, rolling to his feet, his gun still trained on Finch. But the sound waves were disorienting, making it impossible to focus, making the world swim. He knew he couldn't shoot, not with Ruiz heading directly into this sonic battlefield. He had to create a diversion. He had to get Finch away from the entrance, but he took a deep breath, fighting the disorienting assault on his senses, and lunged, not at Finch, but at the precarious, rotting scaffolding near the back of the stage. He struck it with his shoulder, sending a cascade of rusted metal and splintered wood crashing down. The sudden, uncontrolled noise made Finch shriek again, a sound of pure agony. The conductor's focus shifted, his head snapping towards the new cacophony, his sonic weapon momentarily forgotten. No, my silence. You pollute my silence. Thorne used the precious moment of distraction to send a desperate, one-word text to Ruiz. Run. Detective Carmen Ruiz burst through the dilapidated stage door, her service weapon drawn, the urgent dread from Thorne's one-word text overruling her procedural caution. The sight that greeted her was immediately wrong. The air in the auditorium felt heavy, vibrating with a silent, invisible pressure. Dust motes danced erratically in the faint light. Then she saw the source, Thorne, staggering near the crumbling scaffolding, his hands clamped over his ears, and facing him, the impeccably dressed Dr. Finch, who was wielding the baton like a weapon. As Ruiz moved, Finch whipped the baton toward her. The miniaturized emitter on the tip flashed a blinding white, and a focused sound pulse slammed into Ruiz's chest. That it wasn't a noise she heard. It was a noise she felt. A sickening, internal pressure that compressed her lungs and rattled her teeth. The shock wave threw her backward against a pillar, knocking the air from her body. Her vision tunneled, and a high-pitched, agonizing squeal erupted in her ears, drowning out all other thought. She tasted blood and realized she had bitten her tongue. Another instrument of chaos. You are too loud, Detective Ruiz. Finch screamed, his eyes shining with mad fanaticism. Thorne, temporarily shielded by the debris he had created, saw Ruiz fall. The sight snapped him back to cold clarity. He knew the gun was useless. Finch's weapon was not a kinetic one. It was a sonic dampener and attacker, capable of targeting internal vulnerabilities. He yelled, his voice strained and barely audible over the internal shriek in his own head. Carmen, the Celeval. Don't let him hit you again. Ruiz, fighting through the disorientation, saw the open trapdoor where Thorne had been kneeling. She struggled to her feet, ignoring the throbbing pain, and threw herself towards the pit. She didn't have time to descend. She had to create a distraction. Grabbing a heavy, rusted fire extinguisher, she hurled it with all her strength into the dark opening of the resonance chamber. The metal canister hit the polished concrete floor of the acoustic bunker with a dull thud. Finch roared in fury, a sound of almost pure agony. The purity! You dare contaminate the silence! He momentarily abandoned Thorne, rushing towards the pit, his focus entirely on the sanctity of his collection. This was Thorne's chance. Thorne remembered Finch's earlier lecture, a resonating chamber designed to hold a frequency captive where the collective silence would vibrate. The chamber below was designed to contain sound, making it fragile to a sudden, overpowering counterfrequency. Thorne lunged onto the stage, past the agitated Finch, and grabbed the only thing that could possibly help, a massive, ancient pipe organ console, its keys cracked and yellowed, lying half-destroyed near the wall. He threw his weight against the console, trying to tilt it over, aiming for the gaping pit. Finch turned, seeing Thorne's intent, and recognized the true danger. The organ, despite its decay, represented the loudest, most complex sound the auditorium had ever contained. If it fell and broke the seals of the chamber, the crystallized sound could be exposed to the outside air, or worse, the chamber's acoustics could be violently destabilized. No, my masterpiece. Silence! Finch shrieked, swinging the baton with maximum force at Thorne's back. This time, the sound wave didn't just disorient. It was a targeted assault on Thorne's central nervous system. He felt a searing pain, like an electric current running down his spine, followed by a sudden, terrifying emptiness. The internal ringing stopped abruptly, replaced by a profound, deadening silence. Thorne stumbled, the noise-induced adrenaline fleeing his body, leaving him utterly cold and numb. He had been temporarily deafened, possibly permanently. The world had gone mute, but as he looked down, he saw the effect of the blast on the surrounding stage. The sonic force, contained by the surrounding silent walls, had cracked the concrete around the pit's edge, destabilizing the poorly patched trapdoor. With every last ounce of strength, Thorne shoved the organ console one final time. The massive instrument teetered, then crashed down into the pit, striking the edge of the chamber with devastating force. The impact didn't just break the seal. It caused a catastrophic failure of the chamber's soundproofing. The structure ripped open, and the white, shimmering residue, the crystallized sound, was instantly exposed to the humid, unstable atmosphere of the old building. Finch didn't notice. He was too consumed by rage, standing at the edge of the pit, shaking the baton at the falling organ console. Then, the true horror began. The crystalline material, finally freed from its acoustic vacuum, didn't dissipate. Instead, the collected, extracted noise began to violently expand, taking the form of a shimmering, semi-liquid vapor. The air pressure in the auditorium dropped sharply, and the vapor, infused with the essence of 3 silenced victims, began to swirl rapidly, coalescing into a single, massive, transparent column of undulating pressure. Finch slowly turned, his look of fury transforming into a realization of ecstatic horror. The immense, trapped silence was escaping, and it was screaming. The sound wasn't in the air. It was in the walls and the floor, in the very concrete that contained it, and now it was forcing its way out, forming a terrifying, silent, resonant entity that in the sudden, absolute silence of his deafness, Thorne could only see the horror, the swirling, crystalline vapor rapidly enveloping Finch. The conductor's face contorted, not in pain, but in a horrific parody of ecstatic absorption, his body dissolving into the blinding, silent maelstrom of his own captured noise. The catastrophic implosion of the resonance chamber lasted only moments, but it felt like an eternity. When the violent shimmering of the crystalline vapor finally subsided, an unnerving stillness settled over the Hawthorne Auditorium. The air tasted sterile, devoid of all natural scent, a perfect, chilling vacuum. Detective Ruiz slowly pushed herself off the pillar, fighting a wave of nausea. Her head throbbed, and the high-pitched ringing in her ears was now a constant, irritating companion. She saw Thorne standing near the destroyed organ console, staring into the pit. He looked utterly vacant, his hands hanging limp at his sides. "Elias," she rasped, her voice hoarse. He didn't react. She tried again, louder, stumbling toward him. "Elias, are you hurt? Did you see? What happened to him?" She reached him and grabbed his shoulder. Thorne flinched violently, turning to face her with wide, unseeing eyes. He spoke, but his voice was loud, unnaturally booming in the silence of the abandoned theater. It took him. The silence, it devoured the noise, and then it devoured him, Thorne said, his voice echoing back to him flatly, a horrifying sign that he couldn't hear his own words. Ruiz realized with a jolt. He was completely deafened. The sonic attack had successfully achieved its goal for him, if only temporarily. She pulled a notepad and pen from her pocket, scribbling furiously. "He's gone. The vapor. Are you okay?" Thorne read the note, a flicker of comprehension returning to his eyes. He shook his head slowly, pointing to his ears, then tracing a line across his chest where Finch's final blast had hit him. He wrote back, temporary. Shock. We have to clear the scene. Find the source, sirens, distant and muted, finally approached the perimeter. Ruiz nodded, recognizing the need for speed before the chaotic arrival of officialdom contaminated the bizarre crime scene. Within the hour, the auditorium was swarming with uniforms, forensics, and fire marshals. The chief of police, furious and bewildered, demanded answers Ruiz couldn't give without sounding insane. Thorne communicated only through written notes, his composure unnerving to everyone but Ruiz. The focal point remained the breached resonance chamber. Forensic teams gingerly rappelled into the bunker, finding the scene eerily clean. The crystalline vapor had left no residue. Dr. Finch's body was indisputably absent. All that remained was the melted, shattered casing of the sonic baton, and the centerpiece, the horrifying bone and crystal ribcage sculpture. While the technicians bagged the melted baton, Thorne, his eyes now hyper-alert due to the loss of his hearing, focused on the darkest corner of the pit, beneath a collapsed vent. He pointed vigorously, gesturing for Ruiz to investigate. She followed his instructions, donning gloves and pulling away a sheet of moldering fiberglass insulation. Beneath it, nestled in the damp earth, was a waterproof leather satchel. Inside the satchel, there was no money or passport. There was only a thick, spiral-bound composition notebook, Finch's journal, and a stack of pristine, hand-drawn sheet music. Ruiz flipped through the journal. Finch's elegant script chronicled his descent into fanaticism, his loathing of noise, his initial experiments with acoustic extraction, and his joy in creating the perfect silence. The last entries were chillingly triumphant, detailing the harvesting of Vance, Reed, and Wells, the first three movements of the Symphony of Silence. But it was the sheet music that froze Ruiz's blood. It was a complex, original score, meticulously notated. The title, written in bold, stylized calligraphy, was The Symphony of Silence, Movement 4, The Dissonance of the Light. Below the title, Finch had listed the name of the intended instrument for the fourth movement. It was a single, terrifying name, underlined 3 times. Lucas R. Aldous Ruiz recognized the name instantly. Lucas Reynolds wasn't some irritating local. He was the city's beloved, newly elected mayor, known for his charismatic, booming voice and his frequent, loud public appearances. He was the biggest source of official noise in the entire city. Thorne, watching her face, saw the color drain from her cheeks. He grabbed the notebook, reading the name on the sheet music. He looked up at Ruiz, his eyes conveying a terrible understanding. Finch hadn't been working alone in his madness. He had been following a script. The harvest of noise was not over. The conductor was gone, but the symphony was still scheduled to play. Ruiz frantically wrote on her pad, "We need to find Reynolds now. Protection." Thorne shook his head, pointing not to the name, but to a small, almost imperceptible symbol drawn beneath the musical notes. A perfect circle intersected by a vertical line, repeated 3 times. It was a professional recording studio symbol, indicating a complex, triple-layered sound booth. "The venue," Thorne wrote, his pen scratching violently. "Where's the mayor making the biggest noise now?" Finch was meticulous. "It's a stage. It's a recording." Ruiz shoved the satchel into Thorne's hands and dashed for the patrol car, leaving the bewildered police chief shouting in the ruins of the auditorium. The noise of the city, now filtered through her throbbing head, and Thorne's total deafness, felt like a cruel mockery of the silence they had just escaped. Inside the car, the silence was agonizing. Thorne watched Ruiz, reading her lips and interpreting the frustrated punch she gave the steering wheel. The mayor is at the Civic Center Media Hub. He's doing a live, televised address on the budget crisis. It's the loudest, most public thing he does all year, she mouthed frantically, pointing the car toward the downtown district. Thorne nodded, a grim understanding settling over his face. He remembered the symbol on the sheet music, a triple-layered sound booth. The Civic Center's main broadcast studio, where the mayor was speaking, was famous for its state-of-the-art acoustic ceiling. A perfect, temporary resonance chamber. Ruiz grabbed the police radio, her voice sharp with urgency. Central, this is Detective Ruiz. Code 0, immediate extraction required for Mayor Lucas Reynolds. Possible active threat, homicide 1 signature. Notify the Civic Center Media Hub. No one enters or leaves the main studio. She waited for a response that Thorne couldn't hear, his eyes darting between her lips and the road. She slammed her hand down on the horn, a useless gesture to Thorne, as she blew past a red light. "They're delaying," Ruiz shouted, her voice thick with tension. "They want details. They think this is a panic attack after the Finch mess. They're sending uniformed backup, but they won't make it in time." The drive was a frantic blur of flashing lights and near misses. Thorne navigated by pure instinct, reading the traffic flow and anticipating movements in an environment made terrifyingly silent. They screeched to a halt outside the monolithic Civic Center building. The lobby was already chaos. Uniformed officers, reacting slowly to the vague threat, were setting up a perimeter, creating a bottleneck of worried staffers and journalists. Ruiz flashed her badge, dragging Thorne past the security desk. "Homicide, we need access to Studio 3 now." A panicked security guard stammered. "The mayor is live. No one can interrupt the broadcast. The broadcast is the target." Ruiz yelled, pulling Thorne towards the restricted backstage area. As they reached the heavy double doors leading to the broadcast studios, Thorne stopped dead. He tapped Ruiz's shoulder, pointing not at the security camera above, but at the door leading into the adjacent master control room. Standing by the control room door was a man wearing an ID lanyard identifying him as Gary Sullivan, A/V technician. Sullivan was hunched over a heavy equipment case, his back to them, meticulously adjusting a series of long, thick cables that snaked from the case and disappeared beneath the studio door. Ruiz saw the cables. They were too thick, too professional for standard microphone leads. They looked like specialized acoustic conduits, designed for transferring rather than recording. "Sullivan." Ruiz barked. "What is that equipment?" The technician didn't jump. He turned slowly, his eyes wide and vacant, mirroring the same glazed-over serenity Finch had displayed. He was young, perhaps early 30s, with headphones resting around his neck. "It is essential for the clarity of the mayor's message, Detective," Sullivan said, his voice a low, unnerving whisper, despite the surrounding chaos. "He has such a beautiful, powerful frequency. We must ensure it is captured perfectly. The conductor taught me well." Thorne, unable to hear the words, watched the man's mouth. The unnatural calm, the precise, slow movements. It was Finch's fanaticism, transferred. He recognized the coldness in the technician's eyes. Ruiz raised her weapon. "Drop the case, Sullivan." "Now." Sullivan smiled. "The fourth movement requires a stage, Detective, and an audience, and the perfect, amplified frequency." With a sudden, violent movement, Sullivan lunged for a small, red button discreetly mounted on the wall near the studio door. He slammed his palm onto it. From inside Studio 3, the voice of Mayor Lucas Reynolds, addressing the city, instantly escalated. His already powerful baritone boomed through the walls, amplified to an impossible, deafening volume. But it wasn't just loud. It was being driven to an unstable, screaming frequency that physically vibrated the concrete floor beneath their feet. The entire Civic Center Media Hub with its expertly sealed acoustic booths and dense sound equipment, had been converted into a gigantic resonance amplifier. He's overdriven the main broadcast speaker system. Ruiz yelled, though Thorne couldn't hear. He's going to turn the mayor's own voice into the sonic weapon. Sullivan laughed, a high, disturbing sound. Enjoy the music, detective. The sound must be perfect before we can extract it. The immense, overdriven amplification of Mayor Reynolds' voice turned the hallway outside Studio 3 into a war zone of vibration. Plaster dust rained down from the ceiling, and the windows along the corridor began to crack, the sound waves creating visible ripples in the glass. Gary Sullivan, the A/V technician, moved with terrifying speed, drawing a heavy-duty crimping tool from his equipment case. He lunged at Ruiz, using the chaos as cover. "You won't stop the resonance," Sullivan shrieked, his own voice barely audible above the terrifying bass drone emanating from the studio. "The conductor requires the complete frequency." Ruiz sidestepped his attack, the movement jarring her injured body. She fired a warning shot, but the percussion was instantly swallowed and distorted by the chaotic vibrations. The technician merely smiled, recognizing the futility of her weapon against his fanaticism. Thorne, in his world of absolute silence, watched the fight like a slow-motion ballet of violence. He didn't hear the gunshot or the bass roar. He only saw the physical manifestation of the sound, the quivering of Ruiz's jacket, the way the light fixtures buzzed and blurred, and the almost liquid movement of the air itself. He knew they couldn't waste time on Sullivan. The mayor was being destroyed, not by a bullet, but by his own capacity for noise. Thorne focused on the studio door. It was a heavy, sound-sealed barrier, useless to kick, and he scanned the scene and spotted the specialized acoustic cables Sullivan had run. They weren't just transferring sound. They were physically injecting the amplified frequency back into the studio's environment to create an uncontrollable feedback loop. The heaviest cable ran directly alongside the door frame, precisely where the lock mechanism was located. Thorne grabbed a heavy metal fire axe from a nearby emergency station. Ignoring Ruiz's frantic gestures and Sullivan's lunging attack, he focused all his strength on the point where the cable met the door frame. Using the metal axe as a wedge, he drove the blade down, aiming to sever the cable and disrupt the feedback circuit, hoping the physical vibration would carry the message. The massive bass frequency in the studio instantly cut out, replaced by a deafening, piercing whine as the severed cable shorted. The sudden change in pressure was agonizing. Sullivan screamed, a sound of pure anguish and betrayal, his fanatical focus broken. Ruiz capitalized on the distraction, slamming the butt of her pistol against his head. The technician crumpled instantly. Thorne didn't wait. The impact of the axe on the door frame, combined with the extreme pressure change, had warped the metal slightly. He slammed his shoulder against the seal repeatedly, using the brute force of a deaf man who understood only physical impact. With a screech of tortured metal, the soundproof door burst inward. Thorne stumbled into Studio 3, followed immediately by Ruiz. The scene was horrific. Mayor Lucas Reynolds lay slumped on the floor near the podium, his face mottled blue, blood trickling from his ears and nose. His expensive suit was torn, and his eyes were wide in shock. The room was not quiet. A high-frequency feedback squeal still echoed, though rapidly diminishing, but the overwhelming, destructive bass was gone. The entire studio looked like it had been hit by a bomb made of noise. Microphones were shredded, sound-dampening panels had exploded inward, and every glass surface was reduced to fine powder. Ruiz rushed to the mayor, checking his pulse. He's alive. Barely. But his vocal cords, Thorne didn't need to hear. He saw the way the mayor's throat was bulging, severely damaged by the sonic pressure. He moved past Ruiz, his attention drawn to the back of the studio, behind the camera feeds. The purpose of the trap became chillingly clear. It wasn't just designed to kill the mayor. It was designed to maximize the noise before the killing. A high-powered, industrial vacuum rig, disguised as camera equipment, was humming gently in the corner. Leading from the rig were thin, flexible tubes that ended in a series of custom-designed, acoustically perfect capture nozzles pointed directly at the mayor's podium. The system was designed to harvest the immense, amplified sonic energy of the mayor's final, devastating scream. Thorne walked over and kicked the power cord. The vacuum rig died instantly. He reached down and opened the machine's main collection drum. It was lined with the same sound-dampening material as Finch's resonance chamber, and inside, a small, shimmering pile of fresh, crystalline residue, the pure, concentrated dissonance of a light, lay waiting to be collected. Thorne scooped a handful of the inert, crystalline powder into a sterile evidence bag. He looked up at Ruiz, who was securing the mare, her expression a mix of terror and grim determination. He knew their fight was far from over. Sullivan was an accomplice, but the technology, the fanaticism, the resources, they pointed to a network. Finch was not the sole conductor. He was simply the most dedicated instrument. The trauma unit was chaos, but the homicide interrogation rooms remained sterile and cold. Detective Ruiz sat opposite Gary Sullivan, the A/V technician, who was now handcuffed to the steel table. Sullivan was unnervingly placid, the remnants of his fanaticism lending him a chilling composure. Thorne sat beside Ruiz, watching. His hearing loss was a tactical nightmare, forcing him to rely entirely on reading Sullivan's lips and body language. Ruiz knew this was their only chance to break the conspiracy before the symphony of silence continued. "Finch is gone, Sullivan," Ruiz started, her voice deliberately low and measured, though she knew Thorne couldn't hear the inflection. He was absorbed by his own creation. His mission failed. "Tell us who put you up to this." Sullivan gave a slight, almost pitying smile. The conductor achieved perfection, detective. He became one with the great silence. A true artist's passing. He gave his life for the score. "The score," Ruiz scoffed. "We found a journal. We know about Movement 4. The mayor is alive, but his voice is ruined. You failed to extract the dissonance." "A minor technical glitch," Sullivan corrected softly. "The frequency was perfect, but the collection was interrupted." "No matter. The maestro is already preparing the final movement. It is a piece that requires not just a single voice, but the entire collective." "Who is the maestro?" Ruiz demanded, slamming her hand on the table. Sullivan flinched only slightly, a tiny tremor in his left eyelid that Thorne, watching intently, didn't miss. "The maestro is the one who understands true sound, the one who taught the conductor the geometry of silence. He lives in the frequency, detective. He is the frequency." Ruiz leaned in, her voice now a strained whisper. "Give us a name, Sullivan, or you will spend the rest of your life in an acoustic vacuum, just like your precious maestro." Sullivan closed his eyes, his serene smile returning. "You don't understand. The maestro has already scored the city's future. The dissonance of the light was merely a preparatory chord. The final movement is the grand crescendo. It is the end of all noise." While Sullivan spoke in riddles, Thorne was meticulously observing. He was watching the rhythm of Sullivan's breathing, the minute twitches of his fingers. Sullivan's hand, resting on the table, was unconsciously tapping a rhythmic pattern against the steel. Not random, but complex. Thorne quietly took his notepad and pen and drew the triple-layered circle symbol from the sheet music. He pushed it across the table toward Sullivan. Sullivan opened his eyes and glanced at the drawing. His calm fractured for a fraction of a second. His fingers stopped their rhythmic tapping. He looked directly at Thorne, his mouth forming a word that Thorne could only read as signal. Thorne immediately scribbled a question. "Maestro equals radio." Sullivan's eyes widened slightly, a clear affirmative. Then, he quickly composed himself and resumed his tapping. This time, the rhythm was faster, more intentional. Ruiz, watching the silent exchange, was baffled. "What are you doing, Elias?" Thorne ignored her. He was decoding the rhythm. He recognized the pattern. It wasn't Morse code, but something similar, more musical. It was a complex time signature, tapping out a sequence of numbers. 8 to 4, 3 to 2, 0. 1. Ruiz saw the numbers Thorne scribbled. 84321, what is that? An address. Thorne grabbed his phone and quickly typed the numbers into a city search query, adding terms like radio, broadcast, and tower. The results immediately clicked into place. The numbers were not an address, but a frequency and a time. 84.3 FM was the city's oldest and most powerful public radio station, Northwood Public Radio, NPR. The call sign was WNTZ. The rest of the number sequence, 201, was a non-standard military time code, often used by technicians, 02:01 a.m. Thorne immediately wrote on the pad, WNTZ Tower, 2:01 a.m. Final movement. He looked up at Ruiz, his face etched with urgency. The biggest source of citywide, constant, low-frequency sound was the massive WNTZ transmission tower, which broadcast to every corner of Northwood, 24/7. It was an omnipresent hum that the city had long since learned to ignore. The maestro isn't just harvesting individual noise, Ruiz realized, horrified. He's going to use the radio tower to silence the entire city's ambient noise at once, or turn it into a sonic weapon. Sullivan simply smiled. His tapping now ceased. The final movement requires the highest resonance, detective, the largest audience, the city's greatest instrument of continuous noise, and the maestro will be there to conduct. Ruiz drove with a desperate, reckless speed, the city lights blurring into streaking ribbons of color. The massive WNTZ transmission tower was located on the highest point in Northwood County, a desolate, wind-whipped summit known locally as the Antenna Peak. The time on the dashboard clock glowed red, 1:45 a.m. 16 minutes until the scheduled final movement. Thorne sat beside her, his silence amplifying the chaos of the chase. He communicated via rapid, handwritten notes, directing Ruiz through the complex network of backroads leading up the mountain. As they ascended, the atmosphere changed. The constant static hum of the radio tower, usually inaudible in the city, grew into a palpable, low-frequency pressure that vibrated the car's chassis. Ruiz found herself tensing, the noise grating on her already traumatized ears. The whole mountain is shaking. Ruiz shouted, fighting the pressure. It's like the sound is building. Thorne merely watched the landscape, his eyes tracking the subtle movements of the air currents and the tiny, nervous flickers of the tower's red warning lights. To him, the increasing sonic pressure was manifesting as a constant, subtle shimmer in the very air. They reached the guarded gate of the WNTZ compound. The chain-link fence was secured, but the small security booth was empty. Ruiz slammed the car into a hard stop, drawing her gun. He neutralized the guard, Ruiz muttered, kicking the gate open. The main transmission building was a squat, concrete bunker dominated by the colossal, towering antenna array that hummed with immense power. They moved toward the main entrance, finding the reinforced steel door slightly ajar. Inside, the low-frequency drone was deafening to Ruiz, a physical assault on her eardrums. She moved tentatively, navigating a maze of blinking consoles and thick cables. Thorne, however, moved with an uncanny confidence. His deafness, here, was a bizarre advantage. While Ruiz was crippled by the noise, Thorne could focus entirely on the physical vibrations and visual cues, unbothered by the debilitating sonic assault. He pointed down a brightly lit corridor leading to the main broadcast control room. They found the maestro, exactly where Sullivan said he would be, seated at the main control console, surrounded by a complex array of custom-built mixing boards and acoustic dampeners. He was Victor Hale, the chief transmission engineer for WNTZ, a figure known throughout the city only by the technical credits on local broadcasts. Hale was thin, middle-aged, and wore the satisfied, detached expression of a man witnessing the successful climax of a lifetime's work. "Detectives," Hale said calmly, his voice slightly distorted by the intense acoustic pressure in the room. He didn't look up from the complex set of dials he was adjusting. "I assume you found my conductor and his promising apprentice." "The symphony is over, Hale," Ruiz shouted over the drone, her voice cracking. "We shut down movement 4. We know about the final movement." Hale chuckled, a dry, unsettling sound. "Ah, but the final movement requires the entire city as the stage, detective, and I am merely setting the volume." He gestured to a large, newly installed transmission unit, a massive piece of equipment unlike anything standard in the studio. It was connected directly to the tower's primary broadcast feed, and, chillingly, to a large, sealed containment vessel identical to the one Finch had used, only much larger. The vessel was half filled with the terrifying, shimmering crystalline residue, the collected, concentrated noise of the past 3 victims. The final movement is not about harvesting a single sound, Detective, Hale explained, turning a master dial to maximum gain. It's about projecting the harvested silence. He explained his horrific plan. The city's ambient noise, the low, constant hum of millions of lives, is what keeps society balanced. My final movement will not destroy that noise. It will replace it. I am going to broadcast the inverted frequency of all that harvested sound. A perfectly constructed, continuous wave of absolute, physically present silence, directly into every radio, phone, and speaker in Northwood. The resulting dissonance will not just cause deafness, Hale said, his eyes glittering with fanatic zeal. It will cause mass acoustic shock. The city will go silent, but the people will go mad, feeling the psychic weight of 3 murdered voices pressed into their minds. The clock on the console flashed, 2 hours and 30 seconds. It's beautiful, Hale whispered, tapping a final sequence on the keyboard. A city drowning in its own quiet. Ruiz lunged forward, but Hale was too fast. He slammed a large, protective plastic cover over the main control panel. 02:00:55 Hawthorne, watching the visual cue of the clock, and Hale's manic certainty, knew the broadcast was moments away. He couldn't hear the danger, but he could see it. The needle on the transmission gauge was spiking into the red zone. The tower was about to fire. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy, shielded microphone, and hurled it at the master power box feeding the new transmission unit. The microphone struck the box with a sparking thwack. The system sputtered, momentarily delaying the inevitable. 02:00:59. Hale screamed in rage and lunged at Thorne, pulling a serrated scalpel from his suit pocket, the surgical tool used to harvest the victim's voices. 02:01:00. The tower fired. The entire building was momentarily plunged into a blinding, deafening white light, followed by a low, sickening thrum that shook the foundation of the mountain. Thorne saw the needle drop on the gauge. The energy was being diverted, not through the broadcast channel, but into the containment vessel itself. Hale's final act wasn't to broadcast the silence, but to overload the vessel, trying to release the concentrated power as a localized shockwave. The shimmering, crystalline residue in the containment vessel began to vibrate violently, pulsing with captured, silent energy. The moment the transmission tower fired and the energy diverted, the control room became a terrifying stage for a silent battle. The colossal thrumming sensation that shook the building intensified, focusing entirely on the rapidly vibrating containment vessel. Victor Hale, fueled by maniacal fury, lunged at Thorne, the surgical scalpel flashing in the harsh control room light. The final piece must be conducted, Detective. The silence must break the world. Thorne moved not by sound, but by instinct and sight. He watched the subtle shift in Hale's weight, the tightening of his shoulder muscles, predicting the arc of the scalpel. He dodged the first strike, the blade slicing through the air inches from his face. Ruiz, her ears screaming from the intense, low-frequency pressure, fired her weapon, aiming for Hale's leg, but the overwhelming vibration made her shot go wide, striking a nearby console and showering sparks. The sound was a jarring, distorted punch to her senses. Thorne countered, grabbing a handful of thick, insulated cabling. As Hale lunged again, Thorne whipped the cable forward, wrapping it around Hale's legs. Hale stumbled, crashing backward against the main transmission console. The impact caused a catastrophic failure. A wave of shimmering, crystalline vapor, the violently released, concentrated harvested silence, burst forth from the overloaded containment vessel. It was an explosion without noise. Ruiz screamed, but she couldn't hear it. The air pressure dropped so violently that her eardrums felt like they were collapsing inward. The physical shockwave, pure, silent concussive force, slammed her against the far wall, knocking her unconscious. For Thorne, the effect was a purely visual and physical horror. The colorless vapor was instantly freezing everything it touched. Console monitors shattered into dust. Metal surfaces gained a thick, white, silent frost, and the very light in the room seemed to bend and distort. The absolute absence of sound became a physical presence, a suffocating, dense medium. Hale, pinned against the sparking console, faced the silent wave with a look of ecstatic terror. He was not destroyed by the silence. He was absorbed by it. The crystalline energy surged over him, and Victor Hale, the maestro, collapsed into a twitching, frozen effigy, encased in a rapidly growing shell of the white, shimmering residue. Thorn, shielded slightly by the mass of the console, felt the silent wave wash over him. His body felt cold, unnaturally heavy, but the impact, paradoxically, was less disorienting than the sonic attack had been moments before. He was already in the vacuum. He lunged forward, fighting through the physical drag of the silent atmosphere, and grabbed a heavy emergency shutoff switch near the console base, wrenching it down with both hands. The entire WNTZ tower went dark. The low, maddening thrum of the transmission died. The silent, crystalline vapor immediately began to dissipate, leaving behind only the cold residue and the lingering scent of ozone. The silence that followed was not the maestro's oppressive vacuum, but the natural, high-altitude quiet of the wind and the darkness. Thorn stumbled over to Ruiz, checking her pulse. She was breathing, unconscious, her ears bleeding faintly. He lifted her gently, moving her away from the ruined control center. He stood up, surveying the wreckage. The tower was shut down. The maestro was a silent, frozen statue of crystal and bone, and the terrifying symphony was silenced. He moved to a window, looking out over the sleeping city of Northwood. The wind whistled faintly outside. The silence was finally gone. Then, a faint, high-pitched, almost imperceptible ringing reached his consciousness. It wasn't the internal shriek of sonic trauma. It was the natural sound of the wind, distant, thin, but present. His hearing was slowly, painfully, beginning to return. Yes, he turned to check on the frozen effigy of Hale one last time. Thorn noticed something the maestro had been trying to conceal beneath the main keyboard. A secured laptop, running a complex, looping encryption program. Ruiz began to stir, groaning in pain. Thorn pointed at the laptop, then wrote a note, "Global." Ruiz read the note and forced herself to focus on the screen. The encryption program wasn't using Northwood data. It was using worldwide telecom frequency maps, and at the bottom of the screen, a series of coordinates flickered rapidly, pointing not to another U.S. city, but to a remote, mountainous region in Central Europe. Beneath the coordinates, a cryptic message cycled. The audience awaits the final score. The first responders to the WNTZ tower, following the sudden, citywide disruption of the powerful FM frequency, found a scene that defied conventional police work. The control room was a crystalline ruin, centered around the impossibly frozen effigy of Victor Hale. Ruiz, her head pounding but her focus sharp, held the FBI and internal affairs at bay. She stood firm on the truth. 2 homicides solved, a third prevented, and a conspiracy rooted in weaponized silence. Thorn, whose hearing was slowly returning, a tinny, distorted cacophony of white noise and distant voices, backed her up entirely through written statements. "This is ridiculous, Detective Ruiz," snapped Agent Davies of the FBI's counterterrorism unit, waving a hand at the crystalline remains. "You're claiming a disgruntled engineer used crystallized sound to murder people and was then consumed by his own silent explosion? We found traces of a potent psychoactive agent and a high-frequency jamming device. This is sophisticated terror, not acoustic magic. The evidence is right here," Ruiz countered, pointing to the secured laptop. Finch and Hale were part of a coordinated movement, a symphony, and they were preparing for an audience that spans the globe. Thorn, adjusting to the terrifying, incomplete return of sound, focused on the laptop's findings. Forensic analysts quickly managed to bypass the final encryption loop. The maestro's sheet music was a ledger. It confirmed Ruiz's theory. The Symphony of Silence was merely the Northwood overture. The laptop contained detailed plans, manifestos, and funding streams for a secretive, global organization calling itself the Acoustic Purity Society. Their goal was not just to harvest noise, but to weaponize the very concept of silence to enforce compliance and mental stability on a chaotic world. The coordinates revealed the nerve center of the organization, a vast, subterranean complex beneath a remote transmission facility nestled deep in the Swiss Alps. "They're a high-level ideologically motivated cell," Thorn scrawled on his pad, pushing it toward Ruiz. "They use ULF, ultra-low frequency, to control cities. WNTZ was a test. Switzerland is the broadcast hub. Ruiz read the note and then looked Davies directly in the eye. They're planning a synchronized global event, a final score. If they can manipulate the low-frequency hum of a single city, imagine what they can do to the world's telecommunications grid using a base in the Alps. Davies shook his head, already dialing his superiors. This goes to Interpol, detective. You two are off the case. This is federal jurisdiction. You nearly died. You need rest and a full psych evaluation. Thorne felt the raw, buzzing sound of the agent's dismissal pierce his ears, a maddening, distorted insult. He grabbed Ruiz's arm and pulled her aside. They won't move fast enough, Carmen. Thorne wrote quickly, the pen tearing the paper. Davies will spend 2 weeks translating crystallized silence for the bureaucracy. The laptop shows the final score is scheduled for 3 days from now. A global synchronization. We are the only two who understand the silence. Ruiz looked at the laptop screen, then at Thorne's wide, urgent eyes. She felt the lingering, physical violation of the sonic blast, and knew the terrifying potential of Hale's design. This was no longer a murder case. It was a race against oblivion. We go dark, Elias, Ruiz decided, her voice low and determined. We use what's left of our vacation time. We take the evidence, and we don't look back. They slipped away from the chaotic scene under the cover of the morning handover, carrying the laptop and the single evidence bag containing the dissonance of the light residue. They were 2 detectives, wounded and functionally deaf, chasing a global conspiracy from a secluded bunker in the Swiss mountains. The next day, sitting on a cramped flight crossing the Atlantic, Thorne felt the dull ache in his ears subside, replaced by a strange, new sensitivity. The ordinary drone of the jet engines, the muffled conversations, they all seemed slightly too loud, slightly too clear. His auditory nerves, shocked and then forcibly silenced, had returned with the hyper-awareness, allowing him to perceive frequencies others naturally filtered out. He realized the silence hadn't just scarred him. It had given him a new kind of terrifying perception that he wrote the final note for their plan. They want acoustic purity. We need to find the one thing that will overload their perfection. The remote bunker in the Swiss Alps, disguised beneath a meteorological research station, was the antithesis of the Northwood Tower. Silent, insulated, and impossibly deep. Thorne and Ruiz, operating on borrowed funds and adrenaline, reached the facility just hours before the global synchronization time. They navigated the echoing, concrete corridors, Thorne relying on his hyperacute, newly returned hearing. The ambient noise was gone, replaced by a constant, low-frequency pulse, the ULF broadcast signal that others couldn't hear, but that now vibrated the very fillings in Thorne's teeth. It's like listening to the Earth's heartbeat, Thorne scrawled on his pad, wincing as the pressure increased. The whole facility is a tuning fork. They're feeding the ULF signal into the global telecom grid. The goal isn't silence, it's resonant frequency control. They're going to turn the world's ambient noise into a single, cohesive, paralyzing hum. They reached the main command center. It was controlled by a small group of highly educated, unnervingly calm engineers, the core of the Acoustic Purity Society. At the central console sat a severe, older woman, the clear leader, Dr. Helena Vark, a globally renowned communication physicist, and the true maestro. Vark didn't look up. The Northwood overture was flawed. Too much localized noise. Too much dissonance, she said, her voice dry and precise. But here, at the planet's acoustic center, we transmit the final score, the perfect, globally synchronized frequency that will eliminate chaos and restore cognitive order. The massive digital clock on the wall flashed. 4 hours, 59 minutes, and 30 seconds. 30 seconds to global broadcast. Ruiz leveled her weapon. Shut it down, Dr. Vark. You're going to cause mass psychosis. It's a necessary evolution, detective. Vark replied calmly, pressing a final sequence of keys. The human mind can only process so much noise before it breaks. We are merely providing the final, gentle push towards structured thought. 04:59:45. Thorne ignored the verbal threat. He lunged toward the console, not aiming for the keyboard. but for the main transmission unit. He knew he couldn't simply destroy the equipment. The sudden, catastrophic failure of the ULF broadcast would cause an energy spike that could collapse the facility. That he remembered Finch's words. The conductor requires the complete frequency. He also remembered the crystalline residue, the collected, concentrated noise. Thorne fumbled inside the evidence bag, pulling out the small packet of white, shimmering powder, the dissonance of the light. The crystallized sound of Mayor Reynolds' near-fatal scream .0, 4:59:55, that Vark saw the packet, and her calm facade cracked. No, that's unstable noise. That's dissonance. Don't you dare contaminate the signal. Thorne didn't hesitate. With a roar of pure adrenaline, he ripped open the ventilation grate directly above the main transmission coil. He poured the entire packet of crystalline residue, the pure, concentrated antithesis of Vark's ordered silence, directly onto the massive, exposed ULF coil. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The crystallized noise hit the ultra-low frequency coil, introducing a sudden, maximum-level, unstable sonic impurity into the perfectly orchestrated signal. The ULF pulse, which had been synchronized and pure, became a screaming, discordant feedback loop. Instead of a smooth broadcast, the facility was rocked by a physical shriek. The lights exploded. The consoles buckled. The highly ordered sound wave, now contaminated by pure chaos, turned inward, violently disrupting the very acoustic environment of the bunker. The Purity Society engineers staggered back, clutching their heads, their minds unable to process the feedback of their own perfect signal turned into noise. Vark screamed, but her voice was instantly fractured and silenced by the chaotic resonance. The sheer acoustic feedback tore the specialized ULF coil apart. The final score ended in an act of acoustic self-destruction. Thorne, shielding his head, felt the blinding, maddening return of all. The world's filtered noise, car horns, distant radio static, the hum of the city lights, flooding his hypersensitive senses at once. The silent war was over, but the resulting sensory overload was crushing. Ruiz, recovering, tackled the still-twitching Vark, securing her with a zip tie. The Acoustic Purity Society was dismantled. The truth of the Symphony of Silence was met with widespread skepticism by the public, but the evidence, the crystalline residue, the ULF broadcast logs, and the physical remnants of Finch and Hale was undeniable to the intelligence community. 2 days later, back in Northwood, Thorne sat in his apartment, the simple sound of a neighbor's distant TV making his ears ache. He was